Hey, it's Career here, and today we're continuing with the Conquer the Puer and Puer Aeternus series, popularly known as the main child or woman child. We're gonna explore how to overcome codependency and love addiction, also known as limerence. You will understand how these relationship patterns are linked with a devouring mother. And this whole series is based on my book Pistis Demystifying Human Psychology, and you can claim your copy when you join my newsletter down below. So the term limerence was coined by Dorothy Tanoff in the 70s, and it perfectly describes what Jung calls a severe animus and anima projection. And this entanglement feels like a spiritual experience, and it generates an instant recognition, like you've always known that person and perhaps shared hundreds of past lives. You feel completely enmeshed with this one person, and it's like you two are made of the same fabric. You can anticipate everything they're thinking and feeling, and many people even report crazy experiences, like being able to feel the presence or the smell of their partner, even though they're thousands of miles apart. And everything feels magical. But if you ever experience limerence, you know it can turn dark very quickly because the immense highs are compensated by massive amounts of anxiety and constantly obsessing about this one particular person. It's crazy, but it's like your life depends on it. However, relationships based on heavy animus and anima projections tend to be wildly compulsive, and people often enter a vicious cycle of breaking up and reconciling over and over again. And you can't understand why, but something in you becomes hooked to the cycle. And deep down, you know it hurts, but just like an addict, you want just one more drink of this poisonous love. And some people delude themselves and stay in the cycle for years and years. But more often than not, it inevitably leads to a breakup that crushes your spirit. And now you feel like a piece of you is gone and you lose your motivation to live life entirely. The crazy thing is that a lot of people experience limerence with people they met just once or exchanged a few texts online. And in many cases, it's completely platonic, because the chance of being together was always inexistent. However, they give in to these poisonous fantasies and allow them to completely steal their will to live. And that's why I consider limerence to be one of the most powerful drugs that exist, and, in my opinion, it's one of the main factors behind toxic and codependent relationships. And the origins of these dynamics seem to be associated with an unresolved parental complex and attachment issues. And in this video, we'll focus on the first one by discussing how a shame-based identity and enmeshment triggers love addiction and codependency. So in the previous video, we explored how the mother and father complex have the power to basically shape our entire lives. So it's probably a good idea to check it after this one. But to simplify things in a relationship context, we can say that a relationship blueprint emerges from the experience we have with our parents. And let's quickly recap that when receiving love and validation is heavily dependent on fulfilling the life script we discussed previously, it generates an external sense of self-worth and favors a shame-based identity. And to compensate for these feelings of shame, inadequacy, and inferiority, we tend to create a carefully curated persona or a false self. We desperately want to be seen and accepted, and we strive to accomplish that by being immaculate in everything that we do. And we usually operate with the belief, the assumption, that if I can only do this one thing right, they will finally see me or they will finally love me. But we know this day never comes. And when it finally does, unfortunately, it creates even more resentment. And why? Well, because we are not the ones receiving this love, more validation than love, but the character we are playing. So in summary, this external sense of self-worth primes us to abandon our true selves, and instead of looking within, we begin seeking this magical approval in others. And we believe that if we can get this one person to love us, we'll finally feel worthy. The problem is that even when we get that, it's not enough, because the person isn't loving us in the right way or they don't fully get us. And first, this happens because we are not showing our authentic selves. If someone accepts the facade we're putting out, it falls flat, it's not real, and we resent them. And if someone fully sees us for who we are, we also resent them for accepting what we judge as intolerable. So it's a lose-lose situation. And second, this happens because we are not looking for a partner. We are unconsciously seeking the approval of our parents. is a childish desire for an idealized acceptance. And in that sense, the false self fuels love addiction because all of the repressed qualities of our shadow are projected. And we see in other people an idealized version of what we would like to become. In that sense, when we explore limited fantasies, it's not uncommon to hear that a person has a talent you wanted to have. They're pursuing a career you always wanted but never went for it. Or they have qualities you feel you lack, like confidence or being creative and in touch with their emotions. And these fantasies can give us the key to understanding what we have to develop for ourselves. The things we admire also exist in potential inside of us. And we must develop these qualities to finally stop seeking external validation and focus on becoming who we are meant to be. When we fully commit ourselves to creating a life we're proud of, and devote ourselves to developing our talents, abilities, and a craft, limited fantasies simply start fading. But now let's move to the second part. Because the second factor that contributes to codependence in limerence is having experienced enmeshment. And this term was coined by Salvador Minuchin, and it perfectly describes the effects of what Carl Jung calls the devouring mother. Now, it's important to realize that a parent is devouring because they are codependent themselves, and that's why they can be so suffocating and overwhelming. And by the way, I'm using the term devouring mother because that's mostly a feminine dynamic, but fathers can also be devouring, although it's less frequent. So simply put, enmeshment happens when there aren't any boundaries between you and your parents. Everything is blurred and there is no sense of individuality, since they tend to treat you as an extension of themselves. In this situation, parents usually make you the reason for their whole existence and the center of their universe. And they will make sure that you feel this weight. They will tell you that everything they do is for you and it's all the sacrifice they had to make. So you better behave and act exactly like they want and fulfill all of their crazy expectations. So maybe you can pay for this insurmountable debt. Well, no wonder we tend to feel like a burden and start to let go of our wants and needs. Moreover, enmeshment is usually coupled with parentification, which has many degrees, but basically you feel responsible at some level for their emotional well-being. So instead of you being a kid, you suddenly become their confidant. And they tell you everything that's wrong with their relationship and even ask you to make important decisions for them. And if you have siblings, usually become a second parent to them and start bearing many responsibilities that a kid shouldn't have. So when parents are codependent, they unconsciously feel threatened when their kid wants to develop their autonomy and tend to sabotage all of their attempts to grow up. So if you find yourself constantly trying to appease their emotions, of course you'll forget about yourself. And you might even feel like that having your own dreams is wrong and selfish. The problem is that it leads to people pleasing and a severe lack of boundaries. In that sense, a common indicator of enmeshment is having sexual dreams with your parents. I mean, I don't think there's anything more telling than that. But now let's be serious. If you're parentified, I know that you feel excessively responsible for your parents and perhaps constantly guilt-tripped. But it's crucial to understand that appeasing them was never your responsibility. You shouldn't parent your parents. And now that you are an adult, you must realize that putting this weight on yourself is another way to avoid making your own decisions and living your own life. And obviously, I'm not telling you to stop caring and helping your parents. But the only way for this relationship to be healthy is if you both act as adults. So I emphasize once again the importance of individuating from our parents and becoming our own person. Now, when we combine all of these factors, we have the perfect combo for dysfunctional relationships. The mother and father complex are projected, and the codependent relationship blueprint is activated. And now we expect our partner to fulfill the role of a substitute parent and cater to our needs. And we selfishly expect other people to fill our inner voids and provide us with a sense of meaning and purpose. We are after that mother gaze, and we want to be fully seen and accepted. And for it to happen, this object has to be magical. We want all of that to come from an immaculate being whom we put on a pedestal, so they can finally correspond to our idealized fantasies. So in that sense, The limerent object who receives the animus or anima protection has the function of compensating for all of our inferiorities and healing all our wounds. We believe that our entire life will be fixed once we receive validation from this godlike figure. So that's the primary root of romantic obsessions and tends to be the modus operandi of Puers and Puellas. And this tends to happen because people who experience severe limerence usually feel lost, don't have a sense of purpose, don't have clarity about who they are, and honestly don't feel proud about the lives they're living. And instead of facing this reality and taking action to change, they unconsciously choose to indulge in obsessive fantasies, which usually come in moments of extreme frustration and distress. So, in this light, limerence conceals a desire to be rescued, and a childish idea that everything will be magically fixed and solved once you're together. Also, Marie van Franz explains that the poor follow two major tendencies. In the first case, we have Don Juanism, and this pattern is present in both men and women, and it involves constantly hopping from relationship to relationship, unconsciously seeking for their mothers or fathers. And people trapped in this pattern tend to sacrifice their whole personalities to fulfill romantic idealizations. So they're usually overly identified with their bodies and become addicted to winning sexual validation. However, despite all of their encounters, they experience this deep loneliness, since who receives this validation is always the false self. They're also incapable of maintaining any long-term relationship, because as soon as their idealizations are challenged, they tend to flee. When commitment's at stake, they usually choose to keep pursuing their illusions instead of creating a real bond. And Carl Jung also referred to this pattern as the anima woman or animus man. And in the second case, Puers and Puellas avoid relationships entirely by creating an intellectual shield that kills every feeling, and also their sexuality is sacrificed. And usually that's a maneuver to escape the incestuous influence of the mother. But in both cases, the libido remains attached to their parents and to their illusions. Finally, let's talk about integration. So as I mentioned, it's interesting that when we analyze limerent fantasies, they usually highlight repressed desires, needs, talents, and a picture of the life we wish we could be living. And people usually say they got attracted because the person seemed confident and authentic. They're following their passions, they're independent, they're creative, or emotionally expressive. And perhaps they do something you always wanted, but never had the courage to do, or they have a talent you admire. But instead of developing your own personality and exploring your potential limits, you want to live vicariously through them and end up replicating codependent dynamics. So you start seeing the other person as an extension of yourself. And because you get all of your validation from them, there's also an underlying controlling aspect. Because you want them to correspond to your fantasies and demands. And if they don't, you feel frustrated, sad, and sometimes even betrayed. But it's crucial to understand that you are not seeing the real person in front of you, only your projection, since limerence is a mild psychotic state. Now, although all of this seems quite complex, the solution is simple. It obviously requires effort and dedication, but I still think it's fairly simple. We have to fully accept your reality and direct all the energy you spend daydreaming to developing yourself and creating a meaningful life. Now, two things. First, the origins of these fantasies are connected to an unresolved parental complex. And that's why it's imperative to individuate from your parents. And I teach you how to do this in my course Catabasis, the Shadow Integration Matter. And if you want to work one-on-one with me, I also invite you to check my mentorship. Now, second, you must understand what was projected upon your limerent object and develop these qualities for yourself. And I teach you how to do this in this video over here.